recording, I will read the description in the announcement. So we live in a time of extraordinary opportunity, which is also laden with turbulence and peril. While several recent and highly popular accounts of human progress present confident, optimistic pictures of the future, there are also contrary accounts that view reductions in poverty, malnutrition, and violence and improvements in life expectancy, sanitation, and standard of living as coming at great cost and at risk to the planet's biophysical and sociocultural support systems. In this webinar, Harold is going to explore UNESCO's follow-on strategy to the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. That decade ran from 2004 to 2014. The follow-on is the Global Action Program. I consider Harold considers it, if both are up to the task of recent calls by the UN and UNESCO for transformative change and radical enough to meet the educational responsibilities associated with implementing the ambitious UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. By asking big questions such as why sustainable well-being societies are not ubiquitous today, and by taking an exploratory approach to learning how to change by learning about learning, one that considers both the metaphors that guide economically advantaged societies and the possibility of reimagining formal education, Harold will outline 3 fundamental learning failures and strategies to address them. Harold has long been a leader in the sustainability and higher education space. I'm sure many of you have encountered his great work. The bio includes Harold's role as Professor of Environmental and Sustainability Studies and Founding Executive Director of Western Michigan University's nationally recognized Office for Sustainability from 2010 through this year. He is currently co-leading an international project on core competencies in learning for sustainability and recently completed work on the Finnish Innovation Fund's project on learning foundations of sustainable well-being societies. Among many other activities and honors, Harold was instrumental in creating and directing the first UN University Regional Center of Expertise in Education for Sustainable Development in the U.S. in Grand Rapids, and he served as a resource person for the UN University's Institute for Advanced Studies Education for Sustainable Development program. Harold has been an editorial board member of several of the leading sustainability journals. He's currently on the editorial board of Sustainability, the Journal of Record, and he has lectured around the globe. His research focuses on improving well-being for all equitably while reducing the draw on natural, human, and social capital. In another phrase, one planet living. So I will stop there, as I'm sure Harold will get into the details of his approach during this presentation. And we, again, are recording, as always today. The recording will be posted within a couple of days. And so I ask that everyone on the line, whether on your computer or by phone, please mute your lines. And Harold, I'm getting some notes that a couple of people are seeing the bottom line of text on your slide, so perhaps there's a way of adjusting the image so we get the full view, but people are seeing everything except the bottom line right now.
They're not seeing the bottom line of the
Western Michigan
slide?
that says Western Michigan, so maybe you can zoom in a notch and that might correct it. Speaking for myself, I'm seeing the whole thing, so it may just be a question of different people's browser at this point.
Okay, I may not be able to, I apologize, do anything about that over the short term.
Okay, well, it's coming through clearly on my screen. It is not in full screen mode. We are seeing on my screen the upcoming slides along the bottom row, so you might be able to fix that.
What if I did that?
Let's see if it comes.
Is that any better for people?
Yeah, well, that's better on mine. I'll let you know if I get further comments in the chat box. So please proceed, Harold.
Okay, so I'm just going to sort of wing it then, since I don't have my suggestions for text and what I would like to talk about. So if we do run into any questions here, please ask me for more detailed follow-up. How's that?
Sounds good. Again, questions and comments for everyone in the chat box, which I will screen for Harold so that he doesn't need to look at it. And I will be, as always, teeing up the questions and comments for the presenter.
All right. So I'm just going to go through a few desired outcomes for you all who are listening. The first is to gain insights into the concept of sustainable well-being and some of the challenges around achieving it. The second is to learn about the post-UN decade agenda, which is called the GAP, the Global Action Program, and to discuss additional gaps. The third idea is to increase sophistication of the discussion around sustainability core competencies. And then finally, to hopefully help to establish a community of practice around learning for transformative change that has a robust understanding of the challenges and leverage points for creating change. So recent discussions have been full of a series of books that have come out very recently discussing the ideas of progress and the idea that we've moved far ahead in achieving progress globally. So you'll see books like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, Greg Easterbrook's It's Better Than It Looks, Hans Rosling's Factfulness, and Johan Norberg's Progress. And these are just a few of some of the books that have come out recently. And the question here really is that clearly we live in a time of unprecedented opportunity, but it's also a time which is laden with turbulence and peril. And while these popular accounts of human progress present confident and optimistic pictures of the future, there are also contrary accounts that view reductions in poverty and malnutrition and violence and improvements in life expectancy, sanitation, and standard of living as coming at great cost and great risk to the planet's biophysical, sociocultural support system. And in reality, these gains are precarious and easily reversed. So that's the kind of first point I want to make. Now, almost a couple of decades ago, Joel Cohen wrote a brilliant book called How Many People Can the Earth Support? And I hope many of you are familiar with it. If you're not, I encourage you to go back and consider looking at it. So despite those kinds of sanguine assessments that we just discussed about progress and predictions for the future of humanity, the UN Millennium Development Goals targeted to complete in 2015 were not achieved. And in the period subsequent to the 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, many of the biophysical and sociocultural foundations of human well-being eroded further. And these presented yet bigger challenges and also opportunities for improving quality of life for all on a planet with the growing human population and even faster growing production of consumption and production of almost all things: cars, cell phones, clothing, energy, food, housing, luxury goods, water, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer that I suggest to Joel Cohen's book about how many people can the Earth support is that it depends. On one side, those who have unbridled faith in human ingenuity posit that there is no fundamental dependence on the Earth's life support systems because humans are largely exempt from the biophysical rules that govern the rest of nature. The alternative perspective, rooted in intimate knowledge of the state of the planet and quality of life indicators, and grounded in creating a safe and just operating space for people on the planet to flourish, the work of Rockstrom and Kate Rayworth, and many others now, posits that the future of progress rests on sustainable well-being societies and learning how to craft good lives with both dramatically lower per capita levels of consumption and transformative changes in policies, practices, and institutions that don't yet exist. So the big question is going to be, how do we reconcile these opposing views of progress and multiple visions of sustainability and conflicting perspectives on the foundations of sustainable well-being societies? Well, one approach, as described in UNESCO's Rethinking Education, is to consider much more thoughtfully and more rigorously how knowledge as a common good is created, acquired, validated, and used. And also how it is contextualized and transmitted and reproduced and revalidated over time. And I suggest, we think about this statement by David Orr long ago about the role of critical reflection, this effort to expose biases, blind spots, and wishful thinking. And if we don't do this, we risk recreating the decontextualized education systems that produced and perpetuate unsustainable growth-focused economies and equip people to become more effective vandals of the earth, as David Orr said. And I'm not critiquing fundamentally economic growth per se, but the question is what kind of growth, for whom, for how long, what sort of impacts and effects on inequity will we tolerate? Okay, so the real question is, what kind of world do we want? And here are some views on different perspectives about different worlds that people want. What levels, say, of biological diversity do we want? What levels of cultural diversity do we want? Okay, so this brings us to a quote from Arnold Toynbee, the great historian. He said the 20th century will be chiefly remembered by future generations, not as an era of political conflicts or technical inventions, but as an age in which human society dared to think of the welfare of the whole human race as a practical objective. And what I'll suggest is that Toynbee was basically right, but about 100 years off. And so we see with the UN SDGs as the follow-on to the MDGs, we're talking about even more ambitious goals. But one question that we don't see is, what are these individual goals for? How do those goals integrate in some much larger vision that people can relate to? And in relationship to that, what do we mean by this idea of quality education? So that brings us again to another fundamental question about the role of learning in education. What is the purpose of education in this era of conflicting perspectives and rapid change and eroding resilience and increased disparities among rich and poor? In the words of UNESCO General Irina Bokova, quote, education must be about learning how to live on a planet under pressure. And I would add that she's right with one caveat. The goal of living on a planet under pressure, of avoiding collapse, is not really an ultimate goal in itself. And it's certainly not a goal, I think, that most of us would find as an organizing principle for our lives and our communities. So it's a necessary condition, not really a goal, but is only a prerequisite for learning how to live well on a planet under pressure. Living well is the ultimate goal, and that requires learning how to improve quality of life for all by reducing inequalities, building resilience, and creating a robust foundation for flourishing cultural and biological diversity. So that's kind of at the core of what I'm trying to suggest. Okay. So we can look at the UNESCO roadmap, which was the follow-on document to the decade that's also known as the Global Action Program. And you'll see that SDG 4 calls for a wholesale change in the way we think and the way we act, a rethink of how we relate to one another and how we interact with the ecosystems that support our lives. So the rest of this talk is really going to be looking at what do we actually mean by that. Well, sorry, Sitra is the Finnish government's think tank, and they're endowed with over $1 billion. So they ask a lot of big questions. And one of the questions they ask is, what do we mean by sustainable well-being? And what do sustainable well-being societies mean? And so I was asked by the Finnish government to participate in this project around the learning foundations of sustainable well-being societies. And if you're interested, you can look at the website, and there's a book coming out, some of this work. This was sort of the original position paper in 2015 that Sitra colleagues worked on towards a sustainable well-being society, and that's available online. And then this is from one of the meetings I attended as part of this working group for a couple of years on the learning foundations of sustainable well-being societies. So that sort of leads us to the question about what do we mean by sustainability or sustainable well-being societies? And this is my characterization of sustainability in the context of two primary goals. And it's the idea that we want, for sustainable well-being, we want to have a relatively low draw on per capita natural and human capital. And we want to have a high quality of life for everyone. So you see that the two shaded gray areas are examples of where we either have low well-being or high well-being, but high well-being at a very high cost in terms of draw on natural and human capital. And the unacceptable low well-being may have a relatively low draw on natural and human capital, but the result is very, very low well-being. Okay, so here's some data that actually presents these two notions, and I'm working on a book project that actually looks at this with a variety of different metrics. But what you'll see here is that there's kind of a curve where there's a lot of margin of elasticity in the vertical scale and in the horizontal scale. And I posit that you can have high human development at relatively low draw on human and natural capital. And that's the result largely of governance. And in the other case, you can have relatively high quality of life at relatively low draw on human and natural capital. And that has a lot to do with technology and choice architectures that are employed in institutions and structures for economics. Okay. So that kind of leads us into another question that you might draw from Joel Cohen's book, is what are we actually going to do to create these sustainable well-being societies that we envision? So if the question is, how do we advance well-being for all and create paths to sustainable well-being societies? What's the role of learning and education in creating sustainable well-being societies? How do we build sustainability into formal education systems? And to what extent must we reimagine formal education to do this? So here's another quote from Irina Bokeva. This is at the end of the UN Decade meeting in December 2014. It's the time when the Global Action Program was being announced. And Dr. Bokova said, societies everywhere are undergoing deep transformation, and this calls for new forms of education to foster the competencies that societies and economies need today and tomorrow. But again, what do they actually look like? So, what the Global Action Program argues is that ESD is holistic and transformational education, which addresses learning content, outcomes, pedagogy, and the learning environment, and it achieves its purpose by transforming society. But again, how do we do this? And here are the 5 priority action areas of the Global Action Program. The first is to integrate ESD into international and national policies in education and sustainable development. Certainly something that we have not been doing well in the US. 2 is to promote whole institution approaches to ESD at all levels in all settings. 3 is to strengthen the capacity of educators, trainers, and other change agents to become learning facilitators for ESD. 4th, support youth in their role as change agents for sustainable development through ESD. And 5th is to accelerate the search for sustainable development solutions at the local level through ESD. So there are several common themes that come out of the Global Action Program. First is bold calls for transformative change and the importance of aligning our actions with our values and desires to improve quality of life for all. Second is to encouraging and reaffirming commitments to the power of education and learning and fostering meaningful change. And this is very important because UNESCO's commitment in this area around sustainability at the beginning of the decade was really not very strong. And third is tremendous energy, insight, and commitment and leadership from youth. They are on fire. At the follow-on to the decade meeting in 2014 in Nagoya, that was the first time that young people were actually invited, and it was incredibly impressive to see their energy and commitments and their keen intelligence and sophistication. And fourth, there's a growing tension and discomfort around whether we're doing enough, doing the right things, and acting fast enough. And that's really what the focus of my talk today is about. So from the standpoint of the SDGs, healthy human development and the building of sustainable well-being societies clearly rests on a healthy planet and human ingenuity. Education for a sustainable future starts with shedding light, clarifying and articulating individual and collective cares, with understanding one's values and the values of one's community and society and those of others around the world. Which leads us to the question about what's education really for? There's a socialization function, there's a vocational function, there's a liberal humanist function, and there's a transformative function. This is from work from my friend Stephen Sterling. And the question is, lots of conversation, as we know, about this transformative role. We're going to talk about what does it really mean? How well do we understand it? How do we make it happen? So this is B.F. Skinner. In 1982, Skinner was giving a talk to the American Psychological Association. He said, most thoughtful people believe that the world is in serious trouble. And he responded, why isn't more being done? Well, Skinner's response, as you know, is the father of behavioral analysis, was to argue that the future can't act on us. There is no direct contingency for our behavior, for influencing our everyday actions and behaviors. Now, while I agree with Skinner that that's true in a theoretical standpoint, there are lots and lots of things that humans can do to influence behavior based upon our perceptions of potential consequences that we either want to encourage or avoid. And we'll talk more about that subsequently. So, building on Skinner, the question would be, why are sustainable well-being societies not ubiquitous today? Well, what I'm going to argue in referring back to the UNESCO's Global Action Program is that there are many meanings of gap. The first is the idea that humans have clearly demonstrated that we have aspirations regarding improving quality of life for all and the creation of well-being societies, but our actions are not always consistent with those aspirations. So this is my idea. There are many meanings of gaps. So you can see that there have been a whole series of international environment and sustainability events, starting with the Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm in '72. And along the same lines, there have been a series of education for sustainability events starting in 1975, and then the famous Tbilisi Conference in 1977 and follow-on meetings after that. So there's clearly not an issue of awareness, and there's not an issue of aspirations, but the gap in many ways has grown in terms of improving quality of life for all and advancing well-being, as testified by us not meeting the MDGs, and as testified by the effect on natural capital as documented in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. So I'll posit another idea. That the other idea has to deal with how we model these sustainability commitments to the American public and to people globally. So if we look at this axis on the horizontal scale of sort of social and ecological carrying capacity, and a spectrum of sort of exceeded or living within means. And then we look at technology correspondingly. The first would be technological optimism, or the idea of technology as a silver bullet. And then the idea of technology from a pessimistic standpoint, or the idea of technology in a restorative context. And that's the bottom right quadrant that you'll see. And I said, tell me about some movies that fit into these four quadrants. Well, I'll make a hypothesis, a guess right now, that almost all of you can find all kinds of suggested movies in the top left, the top right, and the bottom left. And I'll ask you to think about that now. And if people can write in, Ira, that would be great with suggestions, but I'll sort of run some through. But I have a big question for you in terms of the bottom right quadrant. So in the top left, we have examples of movies like Blade Runner or Soylent Green. Living within means, the quintessential movie is Star Trek, where we've created sort of a dystopian society after a global collapse. We have all kinds of movies like The Road or Mad Max. And then in that bottom lower quadrant, where we model to people the world of our hopes and dreams, we tell the story of transformative change and the creation of sustainable well-being societies and making them ubiquitous, we have a big question mark. And I've given this part of the talk with this slide all around the world for the past 10 years or so, and no one has come up with a suggestion for a movie that really does that job well. And I've offered $25, $50, $100, $200 for people to send those in. I'm seeing on this control panel that they can no longer see these, so maybe that means that they're going through IRA. I apologize. Okay. So here's another form of a gap. Is our perception of reality, our understanding of the state of the world and the state of the planet. So our perception and what's really going on in terms of the state of the planet. So many of you have seen this kind of experiment before. You see those two light blue dots. One of them clearly looks bigger than the other. It turns out that one is not, but clearly all of us always think that the one with the small dots surrounding it actually does look bigger. Here's another slightly more complex one. If I stick a purple line in the middle, the question is the upper gray area and the lower gray area, are those two colors of gray the same, or those two colors of gray different? When you put that purple stripe there, two colors which looked very different all of a sudden look the same. So what you get out here is in these simple experiments is that our perceptions oftentimes deceive us. Here's another example. When we look at our chicken nuggets, we tend not to think about our chicken production factories, our chicken deconstruction factories. When we look at our cell phones, we tend not to think about the niobium mining, the pollution that's associated with production. So here's another idea, is that the whole set of upstream and downstream, what I call ecocultural consequences of our everyday actions in our production and consumption are generally not highly visible. Here's another website that you might look at, which is how many slaves work for you to provide for your standard of living and quality of life. If I was to give you this example of an average piece of clothing, a shirt, say, is about 25 thousandths of an inch thick, and I said, fold that piece of cloth that shirt came from 33 times, how long would that folding be? People tend to say, oh, up to my desk, maybe to the ceiling, and it turns out it's from about New York to Los Angeles. So, and this addresses an idea that I've argued is the relationship between competencies and capacities, capabilities, competencies, and what I call mastery. So the idea is that we have the capacity to think in terms of exponential growth, but we tend not to be cultivating it. So we could be cultivating this understanding of exponential growth from when kids are in preschool or in kindergarten, so that we could do these estimates in a much more sophisticated and thoughtful and rational way, but we tend not to do that. Okay, again, another form of a gap is the calls for transformative change and our understanding of change and learning processes. Another meaning of the gap is how we think humans behave and how we actually do behave. And these ideas in terms of these gaps are discussed in a number of publications of mine, which I will go over at the end for those of you that want to understand more detail. Someone suggested that E.T. was a good movie, and in many ways, it's certainly a good movie, but it doesn't really convey what a sustainable well-being society would look like, and the transition for how we get there. Okay, so I'm going to give you another little short story about an experiment. This is Dan O'Reilly. This is a study he did in The Economist, and it was about subscription rates. So there were two offerings, theeconomist.com online version for $59, or the print and web subscription for $125. And then Dan found out that 68% took the economist.com version, 32% took the print and web subscription. Then he decided to add another option. Well, actually, he didn't do this. The Economist did it. So they have the $59 version and the $125 version as the bookends. And then they said, let's add this third idea right in the middle, which is the print subscription alone at $125. Do you think that that had any effect on the percentage of people that purchased the different options? Well, it may be surprising to you, but I'll show you. The 68% went to 16. The 32% went to 84%. So they got a lot more people to spend $125 and go for the print and web subscription. And naturally, nobody went for the print subscription, and they didn't really care about that. Their goal was to get people to go for the print and web subscription to increase people paying from $59 to $125. So Dan worked closely with Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize for showing that the assumptions of neoclassical economics were not accurate, and became very famous for his work with Amos Tversky on biases. So let's look at education in that context. Education is roughly about formal higher education, about 500 years old. And in that time, we've done a brilliant job with the generation of data, information, and knowledge. And where we've done quite poorly, particularly in the last century, is in the realm of meaning, understanding, and wisdom. So I've posited that that's another fundamental gap. This is John Gardner, who is Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He argued that we tend to lose sight of the common good and the foundations for self-renewal. So what I'm going to argue now is that the reason why transformative change, the kind of sustainable well-being societies that are argued for by Irina Bokeva and a number of people throughout the UN and UNESCO, and the question that was asked by Skinner, has a more fundamental basis, which is that there's a guiding meta-narrative to how we make decisions, how we develop our institutions, including education. And that meta-narrative has four guiding metaphors: anthropocentrism, narrow focus on individualism, the idea that the planet is an infinite source of raw materials and waste sink, and the economic and technological growth are inherent goods and that progress is inevitable. And without a transformation to a different guiding meta-narrative and different guiding metaphors, the possibility of large-scale transformation of society through any mode of education, unless it's one which fundamentally questions those dominant root metaphors, will not be successful. So the argument is we need to move from anthropocentrism to identification with all life and a flourishing earth. We move from narrow individualism to commitment for the common good. We move from this idea of the planet as infinite source of raw materials to Rockstrom and Rayworth's ideas that there are limits and boundaries and guardrails. And this idea, long laid out very clearly by Donella Meadows, that it's not that economic and technological growth are good or bad, but that progress is contingent. It depends upon the kinds of growth, for whom, for how long, who benefits, who loses, what are the costs, what do we do to address the people who are worst off. And in my view of things, that successful heuristics can be developed which help us to have more accurate and appropriate meta-narratives that address those gaps discussed earlier. And my argument is then to leverage the potential of education to help facilitate transformative change. We must actually reimagine higher education. And I have a learning for sustainability framework that helps to address this on a very basic level. So we need to address the content of what we teach. We need to address pedagogy, how we teach what we teach. We need to address context, which is very critical, and oftentimes the significance is underestimated. And the question is, do we model our values and our commitments in everything we do? And then we need to have a meaningful assessment program. So how do we know what and how we teach is having the intended impacts, or if we need to change further? And this is associated with a Learning for Sustainability core competency framework. It's a part of this international collaboration that I co-lead with Stephen Sterling and Marco Rickman, Rob Van Winsberg from UBC, and a number of other people around the world. And it starts with this idea that there are three main areas: values and commitments, knowledge and understanding, social skills, and agency. And if you're interested more, we can talk about this perhaps at the end. But this differs very significantly from the core competency framework by Arnhem Week and others, which really focuses on the learning for sustainability competencies of what they refer to as sustainability experts. This is a framework for learning for sustainability core or key competencies for everyone in the world, and it should be a core of the education system and process. Okay, so there are three temporal strategies for exploring this transformative change. The first is anticipatory, and the idea is to be anticipatory when you can, to be adaptive when you must, and to be ad hoc when you have no other choice. So this is a framework that says we really need to use the capacity that human beings have for planning in a much more sophisticated way. Okay, and now to address the fundamental ideas of Tversky and Kahneman about sort of failed heuristics. Much of my work, and this is described in quite a bit of detail for the Finnish government project on the learning foundations of sustainable well-being societies. Kahneman and Tversky never really addressed the idea of how could we develop better heuristics. What they did in a beautiful way, in a very profound way, was to show the failure of our heuristics. A number of other people like Gary Klein have shown that we can have alternative heuristics that are powerful and effective and guide very, very successful decision making. Another person around the world who's spent their life doing that work is Gerd Gigerenzer. So here are the heuristics for what I call skillful modeling. First is to affirm life, create a clear and compelling vision of the sustainable world we'd love to live in. Use the 4 life-affirming guiding metaphors to screen for inconsistencies and contradictions. Confront the most brutal facts of our current reality to employ creative desperation. Plan for one planet living, do more with less, do better with less, and elevate the common good. Have fun, employ a playful approach to questioning, reasoning, and analysis. Be open to making new connections, spotting coincidences and serendipity. Learn and work with others in nature. There's strength and resilience in diversity. Embrace failure, take risks, experiment, prototype rapidly, and learn constantly. Develop meaningful, robust indicators for measuring sustainable well-being and use them. When considering any decision, ask if it honors and cultivates love. Celebrate corrective action, align choice architectures and institutions with these heuristics. Be bold, fearless, and humble in carrying out these commitments. Act now. Okay, so this kind of leads to a question that many of you who work in the community might ask. Why is effective and resilient higher education sustainability leadership like Neapolitan ice cream? And the question is answered as follows. For it to really be successful, for this idea of transformative change to work in institutions which in many ways have been set up and established to reproduce the status quo, we need to have leadership from senior leaders. And we need to have leadership from students. So this idea of top down from senior leaders, bottom up from students, and it needs to be fully embraced by faculty and staff and have that kind of middle out leadership. And I posit that unless those three forms of leadership are demonstrated, that the kind of transformative change that we're looking for in our institutions, unfortunately, won't happen. So I'm going to close with some articles and book chapters that outline some of this work. First is an interview with Hans von Ginkel, who was rector of United Nations University, that outlines the key project that UNU led on regional centers of expertise in education for sustainable development. And many of you are probably actively involved in that in your home community. I helped create and outline and develop the first UNU RCE in the US in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the second article discusses some of that work. And then in work with a PhD student, Jamie Hirsch, we did a program at ASHE on learning for sustainability core competencies that was based on doing a bunch of survey work with the people that participated in that half-day session. The other piece on this page is some work with Stephen Sterling, Marco Rickman, and Paul Warwick on this International Learning for Sustainability Core Competency project that I mentioned earlier. And then a couple of other pieces, some work on visions of sustainability, a book chapter that's available online. The whole book is available online from Arjen Val's work on social learning for sustainability. And then the most recent piece is this book chapter for the Finnish government's think tank Sitra on towards robust foundations for sustainable well-being societies. And then an example of alternative approaches to pedagogy that are SDG aligned and help encourage and inspire transformative change. A game called Catch, which is an open access natural resource decision-making game that's played face-to-face, but with a background simulation. And a large group of people worked on that over 10 years, developing the game. It was an idea that I had in 2008, and it grew from a conversation with Dennis Meadows, who created a very famous game called Fish Banks. Meadows has always argued that whenever people play fish banks, they crash the fishery, and it's an example of kind of the rapaciousness of humankind, and vindicates Gerhard Harden's hypothesis about tragedy of commons. I always wondered about that, if it was the actual architecture of the game that encouraged that behavior. So that's what inspired the creation of this game, and it allows a much broader, much more expansive set of behaviors, from Harden's Tragedy of the Commons to Elinor Ostrom's Common Property Management for the Common Good. And it does that with a goal, which is catch and retain as many fish as you can and leave as many fish in the sea as possible. So an alternative goal which fundamentally poses a goal which appears to be competitive and maybe conflicting inherently, but the gameplay is where that gets worked out in a very rich and sophisticated way. And then I call your attention, if you don't know about this document, this was a project led by Marco Rickman. It's a UNESCO project on learning objectives for the SDGs. I had nothing to do with that project, but it ties closely to the work being discussed here. And something that many of you also may know about is the SDG Accord, and it's a very interesting strategy. It's not particularly sophisticated in terms of the reporting requirements and the assessment element that I mentioned earlier as being critically important, but it may be something which can help stimulate an interesting conversation on your campuses about the issue of transformative change and some of the ideas that were discussed here today. So I am finished with my presentation, and Ira, I'd be glad to take questions.
Well, I can say, Harold, as wow, you've covered a lot of stuff here, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up questions, but let me start with some of the most basic questions that have come in. First of all, I thank you for pointing us to the range of literature that you yourself are responsible for. A couple people have asked, can you give us a more manageable list with the title and link? And what I can promise to do is to create the Harold Glasser box on the resources page of the SCC website and put them in one convenient place for everyone. I know you're running around doing a gazillion different things, Harold, these days, but when you have a chance to send me that, I will get it posted for everyone if that's possible.
Perfect. I'll send you all those pieces, including the link for Marco's SDG book.
Thank you. Similarly, also at the level of tracking down sites of items that you mentioned, back on your skillful muddling slide, and we might ask you to say a little bit more about skillful muddling, the concept, but I was scribbling down here myself your mention of Gary Klein and, at least the way
Gerd Gigerenzer.
And I wrote down Gigeranska, so maybe you can clarify what we're looking for on those two.
Okay. Do you want me to say something about that now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I didn't go into it, and there's a really deep and rich literature and a long story. It is outlined in the chapter for the Finnish government for CITRA. They gave me 2 book chapters, so it's a long 32-page or 33-page piece, but you'll get all the references and details in there. But the short story is that Dan Kahneman and Amos Tversky did an absolutely, brilliant job, and this is why Dan Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, Tversky didn't, because he passed away. Outlining human beings' cognitive biases, and you'll see the discussions of that in the literature and podcasts, all the time these days. The problem with their work, if one can say there's a problem with it, is that in doing this absolutely brilliant job of talking about humans' cognitive biases, they really didn't give any examples about how human beings exhibit the use of heuristics. So the whole idea is around our heuristics being bad in terms of this idea of cognitive biases. What they didn't talk about was our use of heuristics in powerful and profound ways. And Gary Klein has spent his life in showing that human beings can also use heuristics in ways that help us to very, very efficiently solve incredibly complex problems. And I talk about the idea of wicked problems and strategies for addressing wicked problems. And Gerd Gigerenzer has done the same kind of thing with his work. Neither of them applied their research to the ideas of transformative change or sustainability per se. So what I've done is sort of draw on some of the work that they did, demonstrating that human beings oftentimes can develop very, very powerful and useful heuristics. And what I've been arguing is that the core heuristics associated with those guiding metaphors, where we have a very, very fundamental problem is with those gaps that I was mentioning. So our understanding of the state of the planet is so profoundly off because our heuristics for understanding the way the world works are off. Now, certainly those are things that human beings can change, but we shouldn't expect that behaviors associated with the structure of our institutions or economic systems would be anything other than what they are when those guiding metaphors that don't incorporate the ideas of boundaries, as Rockstrom et al. Have discussed, and as Kate Rayworth discusses in her beautiful book, Donut Economics.
Very good.
Does that make sense?
That was great, and it also perfectly tees up the next question I was going to ask you. Early on in your presentation, one of our attendees, Linda Urban, anticipated that you would at some point reference the work of Donella Meadows and the limits for growth stuff. And you eventually got to a slide, not the one with the movies, but another one that had 4 quadrants, where on the lower right you had Kate Rayworth, and then the lower left, that's where you placed limits to growth, I believe. Did I get that right? Perhaps you could go scroll back to that slide in your deck, and I just thought it was worth another quick run through.
Let's see if I can. The system, unfortunately, that I have, unless let's see.
Keep going.
Can you pick out from, you can probably see this, which slide it is you're talking about?
I cannot see from, oh, there we go.
Any of these?
It was at toward the beginning. If you could go back to the first slide set.
Yep, we're at the top now.
Okay, okay. There's a little bit of a lag, so it has been jumping around. So let me see if I can pick out the one that I'm talking about.
There's no literal slide, I think, that has Rayworth and Meadows on there.
Yeah, you were doing the voiceover for it, but in any event, I'll just ask, I think the word that you may have used, if this triggers your recollection, was contingent.
Okay, I think that's when I was talking about the idea of economic growth.
Right.
So
I'm not sure which slide
the idea there
was.
I think it was this slide. Okay, so this is the 4 quadrants that you were probably referring to. So the idea here is this, that with all the calls for transformative change, the argument that I'm trying to make is that it's wonderful and fantastic. Maybe let me just step back, I guess, for a second. When I first started working with Hans von Ginkel before the decade started, so around 2003, and at that point, UNESCO was really not in favor of the getting engaged in the decade because they had a lot of other things that they were trying to address with early childhood education, disparities in access for women. And so this whole idea of sustainability, they didn't really understand, where it would fit and sort of what it was really all about. And in the subsequent period associated with the end of the decade, UNESCO came to have a very, very different opinion about the significance of sustainability as this idea of improving quality of life for all. And out of that effort grew this idea that, so sustainability becomes this organizing principle around improving quality of life for all, and transformative change becomes the key. So everyone realizes that, we haven't been doing, as I mentioned earlier, maybe not doing the right things in the right ways, fast enough. We're not really using a sophisticated understanding of Donella Meadows' idea about leverage points and ways to intervene in the system. And as you note, her most significant lever is this idea of changing paradigms. And essentially that's what I'm getting at. So the core of what I'm trying to say here is that transformative change only works when it's consistent with the meta-narrative that guides everything that we do. So that there is a dominant meta-narrative which underlies all of our decision making, our institutions, our economic systems, our production and consumption systems. And I'm trying to say that it's driven by these four guiding metaphors: anthropocentrism, focus on narrow self-interest, this idea of the planet as an infinite source of raw materials and waste sink, and then this idea that really becomes very, very powerful with the Enlightenment. And you'll see it's the idea that underlies the critique that I had in the beginning of the talk about the books by Hans Rosling, Factfulness, Norberg's Progress, Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, Greg Easterbrook's It's Better Than It Looks. And this is the fundamental idea here, is that economic and technological growth are inherently good and that progress is inevitable. That's the guiding metaphor for all of those recent books. And what I'm trying to say is they're missing the ideas of Rayworth and Rockstrom, that their fundamental biophysical boundaries and their sociocultural boundaries. And so the idea that builds on that, where Donella Meadows really beautifully spoke on this whole question about economic growth. She said that economic growth, and I'm arguing economic and technological growth, are neither good nor bad inherently. It depends upon growth of what, for whom, for how long. So then progress is fundamentally contingent upon those decisions. It's not an inevitability, as Rosling and Pinker and Norberg and others are saying.
There it is. That's what when you push the extra couple of buttons to show the square on the right side, then the contingent word popped up. So that was a great response.
Hopefully.
Let me give you some of the other input from the attendees, because we had a rather sophisticated audience here today. One that I wanted to make sure you were aware of is, again, from Linda Urban. Early on in the presentation, she said, in terms of how and why people do not work toward their aspirations, it reminded her of the work of Robert Keegan, for example, Immunity to Change, which she says she's currently reading. On your slide with trying to select movies, I haven't seen it yet, but Amy Dvorak offered up Black Panther. So I'm not sure if you've seen that yet, Harold, and where that might fit in.
Interesting question, and I have seen it. It certainly, the question is this with respect to Black Panther. The question that I'm trying to get at, and the question that I'm trying to answer, is how do we get from here to there? So there's two issues. One is that in our mass media, the dystopias far outweigh anything we're doing that describes a world of our hopes and dreams. And then the question of Black Panther is that they're endowed with this, magical metal, which again is this kind of technological optimistic vision that creates this possibility or opportunity for all these great things to have. And that fundamental notion is really at odds with the idea that Rayworth and Rockstrom and myself and others are trying to address, which is there are fundamental limits to the planet's carrying capacity. And even more fundamental, there are limits to our sociocultural carrying capacity. And this goes back to Joel Cohen's book about how many people can the earth support. His answer is it depends. He spent, 450 pages in a beautiful book with fantastic data and stories. And then the answer is it depends. So Black Panther, I think, is a great movie. It addresses all kinds of wonderful, issues and topics that are current and need to be addressed in our cultural conversation today, but it doesn't really fit in that lower bottom corner because it doesn't address these inherent issues around boundaries and guardrails and the transition for how we get from the world where we are now, to that world in a realistic way. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you for laying that out. And for those who are still with us, and there are still several folks with us online, we're going a little long because we started a little late. So just hang in there with us. And if you have to jump off, the recording will be posted shortly. But a couple of more comments that came in from the audience for your information, Harold. The always quotable Anton Camerata has agreed with you completely that organizations are manifestations of fundamental metaphors and beliefs of the founders and leaders. And he suggests that what you're saying is also a restatement of the aphorism, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Moving on, Linda Urban also recommended a great book called Eco-Justice Education that talks about the necessary paradigm shifts with the ideas of how to integrate in education at various levels. That was a 2015 book from Routledge. Mm-hmm. And then I think we can wrap up with this follow-on question from Anton Camerata, which is the UNESCO learning objectives that you mentioned. Do they address these changes in metaphors or beliefs, or did they miss out on having you contribute to that?
Anton, thank you very much for that question. So my colleague Marco Rickman was responsible for that document. And he is a person who's part of this international collaborative team that I co-lead on learning for sustainability core competencies. And the short answer to Anton's question is no, they don't, in my mind, really address it. So it's an issue of sort of rhetoric versus what we are really doing practically in that realm of content, pedagogy, modeling, or context and assessment. But I would say the conversation is happening. And it's an ongoing, sort of tug of war. And very differently from when I first got involved in some of these conversations, 15 years ago, we're having them in a rich and robust way. So I'm part of a technical advisory committee for the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education in New Delhi. And there's a conference in November there. And these issues that Anton, is raising that were not a part of a significant part of the SDG learning outcomes book are going to be a part of that conversation at that international meeting in November. So I think one of the things that for me has been really quite profound is the introduction of these questions around transformative change and really deep, sophisticated levels of learning that address fundamental assumptions there's a really profound way that makes that much more palatable, people, and that's through this idea of gamification. And surprisingly, you know, part of my job is to sort of follow Donella Meadows and look for those leverage points. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing has been addressing the content and the pedagogy and some of the modeling aspects through the development of what we call serious games that kind of allow introducing of these ideas in a way that puts people at ease and kind of softens them rather than hits them over the head with the challenges of transformative change. So I hope that helps to answer that very good question from Anton.
Yes, thanks, Harold. And it also triggers a thought that perhaps after that meeting in November that you just mentioned, you can circle back and give us an update in your next webinar for the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. With that, I think we do need to end for today. An excellent presentation and also great questions and comments from the audience. I know that some of you on the line are going to be joining us in Pittsburgh at the faculty conference. I also know that there was a write-in campaign to get Anton Camerata to come to Pittsburgh, so please send your cards and letters to Anton telling him that he has to come. We look forward to seeing Linda Urban and others in Pittsburgh. And Harold, I know that you're not able to make it, but I am going to follow up with you before then to make sure that your perspectives get included in the joint workshop on sustainability competencies that we'll be doing with the Council of Environmental Deans and Directors. There was so much in this presentation that they will need to hear about. And with that, thanks again, Harold. It was tremendous.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ira.